Hey guys, it's Ashley and welcome to day 7 of my 12 days of BOOKMAS video marathon. Today I'm going to be talking about all of the best fantasies that I read this year in 2020. As you've probably already noticed with a lot of these videos, there is a bit of overlap of books. It's kind of hard to make a series of best books I read this year kind of thing without having multiple books in the same video, so I'm doing my best to include some titles that I haven't talked about already in these videos, but there's gonna be overlap. It's inevitable. So if I've already talked about a book and you don't want to hear any more about it, you can definitely just press that little arrow key and skip forward like 10 seconds, you know, and just get to the next book. But if you want to hear all of it, I will talk about all of it. And here we go! I'll start off with one that I have already talked about in my very first video that I did, and that is Legendborn by Tracy Deonn. This story is an urban fantasy with a King Arthur retelling twist on it. It's about this girl named Bree whose mother just died and she's suffering through the grief of that. She decides to attend this, bright scholars academic program thing at UNC Chapel Hill, which is kind of like an early admission for high schoolers kind of thing. And then she witnesses this magical attack, and then she realizes that the lineage of King Arthur and his knight round table, whatever the thing is called, all live there, and that they are preparing for lots of things that are happening, and she realizes that her mother's death might have something to do with all of this. So she decides to infiltrate them, and lots of things happen. First of all, the story was a really fun fantasy. It was a really cool urban fantasy setting with King Arthur, and you're learning about how they work and all of that, and it was just interesting and fun to read about that. But there's also this undercurrent of not darkness, but sort of a heavier material, because Bree is grieving for her mother, and she's learning all of these things that, she doesn't know if her mother's death was a murder, if it was an accident. She doesn't know what happened at this point. So, she's really struggling with her grief and coming to terms with it, and, because she never got that closure, and then she found out that somebody erased her memories, and it's just this wild thing. But more importantly, this story really touches on a lot of African American history and really sort of brings that into the light with this fantasy. There are times when it's fun and interesting, and then there are times when it's just you're hit in the gut with something that you didn't know about, or something that rings really true. Very eye-opening, but also a really good time because of the fantasy. It's a great blend of everything. It's a great blend of speaking to current times while also keeping you in this sort of imaginative fantasy state that you are going through, and also Bree as a character is very grounded in her personality, and she just feels like such a real person. Yeah, just a really good book. I'm just gonna stop there. This next one probably will not be much of a surprise to you, but that is The Tower of Nero by Rick Riordan, which is the 5th book in the Trials of Apollo series. As you guys know, I'm a major Percy Jackson fan, so this story was not going to be on this list. I absolutely loved the final installment in the Trials of Apollo series. It wrapped up everything really nicely while also leaving a couple of open-ended things that could possibly lead to standalone stories in the future, which makes me really excited for all of Rick Riordan's work in the future. As I've already mentioned before loads of times, I love Apollo's character development through this story, and especially in this book when everything really comes full circle. I also really love Meg even more than I did throughout the whole series, but especially in this book. She's amazing and so great, and Nico and Will and Rachel and everybody who ends up coming back in this book, it's just everything about it made me so happy, so scared, but also so happy. So this one is definitely on this list, one of the best fantasies I read this year. But yeah, the story was just a really great way to end the series, and I'm very excited for what is possibly to come. Next up we have Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. If you don't already know, Mistborn is a YA high fantasy following a character named Vin, who is sort of a street urchin, and she has this power, but she doesn't really know what it is or how to work it. And one day she meets this guy named Kelsier, but in reality Kelsier really is the one who finds her and seeks her out, but they end up meeting and she ends up joining their thieving crew, and their goal is to take down the government. The world that they are moving in and the magic that they're working with is just so in-depth and is so interesting to read about, because it really puts you in that space while you're reading. And so I'm definitely looking forward to the 2nd book and the 3rd book and whatever else he's written, because I'm really starting to love his work, and I'm just excited that I'm finally getting to it, because I've heard people talk about Brandon Sanderson for so long and I'm just starting, apparently. So I'm very excited for what's to come. But yeah, this was a great fantasy. I really loved it, and in the beginning I was sort of, slowly getting through it, and then all of a sudden it got to a point where I was like, oh my god, and I just kept flipping and flipping, and it was so great. Then we have A Song of Wraiths and Ruin by Roseanne A. Brown. This story is a dual perspective, West African inspired fantasy following Karina and Malik. Karina is the princess of this kingdom that we're following, Zoran, and Malik is one of the sort of lower class citizens of this world, and so essentially what happens is he kind of smuggles himself and his family into this kingdom and gets in debt to this creepy spirit thing, and he ends up joining this competition for this big festival thing that's happening throughout the week. Karina, as the princess, is, you know, the one in charge of the festival thing, and so she decides that the winner is going to take her hand in marriage and be the king, but there's, like, you know, ulterior motives on both sides, so you don't really know what's going to happen or who's going to win and get what they want. And of course there's a bit of romance that ensues along the way, and it's just a wonderful fantasy story. I'm definitely gonna have to reread this before the second one comes out next year, but I'm really, really looking forward to it because not only did the story leave off on a cliffhanger, but I just love these characters so much. Like, Karina is very strong-headed, very stubborn, sometimes a little bit annoying, but is really a strong female lead. And then Malik is just so soft-hearted and kind and like the complete opposite of Karina, and it's so, so great to read about both of them and to see how they come together and collide in a way. It's so good. And I feel like in the next story their roles might possibly end up like switching in a way, so I'm eager to see how that is going to happen and just what is going to happen after the way that this story ended. Oh my god. Then we have The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, which I knew that I was going to enjoy, but I didn't realize how much I would enjoy it until I actually read it, and it really blew me away. The story is about a lot of things, but in its most basic terms, we have these two characters, Celia and Marco, who are magicians, and they are bound into this competition that takes place in the Night Circus, which is a sort of traveling circus that goes around the world, and they basically compete with their magic to like outdo one another. But the reason that I said it's about a lot of things is because we follow basically almost every character that we meet, we end up following in some way, shape, or form. I've said this a lot about this book on my channel, so I won't spend too much time on this point, but this story is just so atmospheric. It's so like mood setting, if that makes sense. It's got such a like dark, magical, whimsical feel to it. It just makes you want to literally jump into the pages and like live in this world. Not only that, but the forbidden sort of romance that happens in this story is just so good, and I love it so much. And even though it's not like the main part of the story, like I said, there's so many other things that are happening. It's just every time we would come back to those scenes, I'd be like, oh yes, I'm so excited. So yeah, this story was definitely a much different fantasy than a lot of the ones that I have on this list right now, but I really, really enjoyed it, and I'm really looking forward to reading Erin Morgenstern's other work next year, specifically The Starless Sea, because I've heard so much about it. So yeah, this one really turned me on to her work. So the second to last book on this list is Graceling by Kristen Kishore. If you haven't heard me talk about this a million times already, essentially we follow this character named Katza who has a grace for killing. A grace in this world is something that you are extraordinarily good at, unlike other people. So you can have a cooking grace, a dancing grace, blah, blah, blah. So the story follows Katza as she ends up breaking this guy out of some other kingdom's prison because she works for a different king, and then come to find out that guy was the grandfather of the current prince of a different kingdom, so that prince ends up coming to see her and find out what happened to his grandfather, and then they realize that there's another kingdom, there's a lot of stuff happening here, that is sort of like playing everybody and like, you know, working to kind of overthrow everybody in a way, and so they decide to work together in order to stop that from happening. It sounds complicated, but I promise you it's not. It's really a good story. So one of the specific things that I liked about this story was Katza, the main character.
Hello, it's Editing Ashley here. I just wanted to come in here real quick because what I ended up saying in the video when I filmed was just a very long-winded explanation of not at all what I was trying to get to. What I wanted to say was I love her character because no matter how hard and stubborn and, you know, she doesn't let things permeate her or change her feelings, she cares for her people, and it shows through the book with the actions that she's willing to take to help others. So that's what I really love about her. She has like this hard exterior that you see a lot of the time, but her actions reflect what she really feels, if that makes sense. I hope I'm saying that right, but I liked that.
There were definitely a lot of twists in the story that I enjoyed, things that I wasn't expecting, but one of the things that I, in the moment, wasn't too crazy about, but looking back on it now, actually appreciate, is the way that this story ends. There's a certain point in this book where you're reading a scene and you're like, this could really be the end of the story. Like, there are a couple of loose threads, but like, you know, this could be the end, and then we could go into book 2 and finish all of the other stuff. But then you see that you have like literally 200 pages left, and you're like, what else is there to read about? And then you go into the like last 200 pages of the story and you're like, oh, there's a lot more. Initially when I was reading that part, I wasn't super crazy about it just because I wanted it to kind of end, and then it kept going and I was like, where else are we going with this? But by the time that we got to the very, very end, I was actually really pleased with all of it. This was just a really good fantasy story, and I really can't wait to read the next one, even though I've said multiple times that I'm planning on reading it and just still haven't gotten to it yet. I will get to it. You will see that sequel again in one of these videos, I promise you. I lied, there are actually 2 more fantasies on this list that I need to get to, and I will not spend too much time on them because they are ones that I've talked about so much already. The first of which is Scythe by Neal Shusterman. I'm literally not gonna say anything else. I've already talked about this. That's it. Obviously, it was one of the best. The second one that I wanted to talk about was also, obviously, Hollowpox and Wondersmith by Jessica Townsend, which are the second and third books in Nevermore. Not gonna spend a whole lot of time on these. If you haven't read them yet, it's about a girl named Morrigan Crow who is born on the unluckiest day in the year, and so she's deemed as like a cursed child and blamed for anything that goes wrong. And one day on the day that she is supposed to die, because cursed children don't live very long in this world, she gets whisked away by Jupiter North, who ends up taking her to Nevermore, and she gets to compete for a chance to win a spot in the Wondrous Society school. It's a really fun, wacky story. I love it to pieces. If I haven't talked about this enough already, you guys should know by now. I love this story to pieces. Definitely one of the best fantasies that I've read this year. I am in love with everything about these, and that's all I'm gonna say. And before I go, I did want to give like an honorable mention to The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. The reason this is just an honorable mention and not one of the best fantasies I read is because I'm not sure that you could classify this completely as a fantasy. Like, it's got fantastical elements, but it's also got, you know, obviously real world, so it's more of like an urban fantasy, but then in addition you've got like the historical fiction element to it, so it's like, what is this? If you think of this as a full fantasy, then yes, this would be included on this list because this book was absolutely incredible. But if you don't think of this as a full fantasy, then I'm just gonna give it an honorable mention. Obviously, this was one of the best books that I read this year. You will be seeing this story again sometime in a video soon. Clearly. It's so good. It's so good. I want to reread this already, to be honest with you, but I'm forcing myself not to because I know that once I do, I will probably fall into another slump, and I can't do that to myself, so I'm not going to. We're just not gonna reread this, but it's so good. Addie LaRue makes a deal with the devil for immortal life, but he makes it so that nobody remembers her and she's doomed to be forgotten by everyone she meets. Then one day in the real world, a boy working in a bookstore remembers her, and things ensue from there. And so those were some of the best fantasies that I read this year. There were quite a few on this list, so I hope you all stuck with me through that. Next year, I am definitely going to dedicate to reading just as many, if not more, fantasy stories. I have so many on my list, so many that are, you know, TBR reads that I don't have yet, or that I've wanted to read for a while now and just haven't gotten to. I just really want to kick ass with fantasy next year, you guys. Like, that's really just all I want. So I'm crossing my fingers that that happens. If you enjoy reading fantasy, what was the best fantasy that you read this year? Definitely let me know down below. So I think that is going to be everything for this video. If you want to follow me on any of my socials, all of my handles are in the description below. Thank you guys so much for watching day 7, is it, of my 12 days of BOOKMAS video marathon, and I will catch you later. Bye!